chapters, you find out Ahab is more like a little kid than a king. So as we come to chapter 21, let me read this to you from David Schaefer. He says, a fatal attraction is nothing more than a secret sin or a sinful attitude or activity that we have allowed to bloom. It is something we find ourselves drawn to that we know is dangerous and sinful, yet we have convinced ourselves that it's safe for us. Perhaps we've even cultivated this attraction in private. There is hidden within all of us a fatal attraction. We may ignore it, assuring ourselves that we have it under control. We may fear it, terrified that it may one day be our undoing. Each of us has a sensitivity to different temptations. Some of us are extremely susceptible to financial temptations, others to sexual temptations, while others are vulnerable to temptations of fame or power. One unaddressed evil passion in our lives is all it takes. He says, remember, a fatal attraction never lies dormant and deafens us to God's work and voice. We're going to talk about today covetousness. And in chapter 1, Ahab, just like a little kid, seeks to soothe his disappointment from the judgment of chapter 20. And he sees this vineyard. Now, Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. But in Jezreel, which is in the northern part of Israel, was a second palace that Ahab and Jezebel stayed in from time to time. And next to this palace in Jezreel is this beautiful vineyard. I mean, Ahab, no doubt, looks out his window and he sees that, boy, I really want that vineyard. Now, I venture to say that none of us are doing that over a vineyard today, right? And sometimes we take Scripture and we say, well, that doesn't apply to me. But I would venture to say that some of us have seen a nice car drive down the road and say, man, I wish I had that car or that truck. Maybe we've seen and we drove past a beautiful new home, or we've seen it, you know. One of our favorite shows is House Hunters, right? I don't know if any of you like House Hunters. You see these magnificent homes. And sometimes you think, man, I really wish I could have that. Maybe it's a position at work, and you see, boy, I'd really like to have that position. Maybe it's looking at another family, right? You know, on Facebook, all the family pictures just look perfect, right? They don't tell you that they photoshopped them. But we look at that and we say, man, I wish my family was like that. And so, what this does, covetousness, leads to, if it's uncontrolled, leads to disobedience, ingratitude, and unbelief. And these things always lead to discontentment and a desire for something more than what God has given us. If we were to take inventory this morning, I think all of us would have to say God has abundantly and graciously blessed every one of us. Well, Ahab sees this vineyard, and it becomes uncontrolled covetousness that leads to sin and destruction. Ahab and Jezebel arrogantly and ruthlessly misuse their power, abuse their power in a great miscarriage of justice and murder against the righteous man Naboth. They can't get it lawfully, so they're going to get it by any means. Have you ever known someone like that? They have a goal in their mind, and I'm going to get it no matter what. How many lives have been destroyed with that kind of thinking? How many families and homes and relationships have been destroyed because of that? And so we see as believers, we must recognize the results of pursuing wrongful desires in our lives. Because every one of us have a temptation of some sort to pursue something that is beyond God's provisions. And we need to examine in our own hearts, are there any areas of deceitfulness within us? Are we trying to manipulate a situation? Are we being deceitful or lying even to get something that we want? I won't ask you if you've ever done that, because we probably all have been guilty of that at some point in our lives. Well, let's look at the first 6 verses. We see a wandering passion, beginning in verse 1. Now it came about after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is close beside my house. And I will give you a better vineyard than it in its place. If you like, I will give you the price of it in money." Verse 3, but Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid me that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." A covetous look, verses 1 to 3. As I said, Ahab's secondary palace is in the city of Jezreel, north of Samaria and south of Mount Gilboa. And so Ahab seeks to purchase the property of Naboth's family. Now remember, going back, you go back to Joshua, you go back even to the time of Abraham, God gave the children of Israel their land. And when Joshua handed out the inheritance, the intent was that that was your family's inheritance forever. And remember, even the laws, if you were to sell it for a period of time, it was just to the year of Jubilee. Remember, the year of Jubilee happened every 50 years. And the price that you sold it for was based on how close it was to the year of Jubilee. Because in the year of Jubilee, all inheritances went back to their original families. We don't see that much in America today, but there are those you probably have heard of, or maybe you know an old farmer somewhere that property's been in their family for a long time. That's the kind of sense, but even a greater. You just didn't sell your family property. But Ahab has this strong desire. And he makes Naboth a generous and reasonable offer. Now, Ahab, even though he was ungodly, was still governed by the laws of God. And so it was specific in the law that the king did not have power to just take land, a person's inheritance. Now that was different than all of the other nations around them. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Jezebel in a minute. But he makes them this offer. I will give you another vineyard someplace else that's just as good. Or if you want, I'll just give you a boatload of money. That's what he's saying. But Naboth, we find very quickly, is still a true worshiper of Jehovah God. And the idea of selling his family inheritance was not even a consideration. Was not even a thought, would not even do it. Not even consider it. And we see that in spite of Ahab and Jezebel's effort, there are still those who serve Jehovah God. Remember what he told Elijah last week? I still had 7,000 reserved. There was a remnant. Even though it looked dire in Israel, there were still men like Naboth who served the true God. It looks dark in America today, doesn't it? And sometimes we wonder how many really Christians there are left. But let me tell you, God's got His remnant. We look at the Jewish people, how cut off they are from God in this moment, but there are still a remnant of Jewish people who serve the Lord. It amazes me sometimes when we get a glimpse into some of the closed countries around the world, some of the communist countries, and you find out there are Christians in those countries. God will never leave Himself without a witness. And we see that in Naboth. Going on to verse 4. So Ahab came into his house sullen and vexed because the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. He said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed and turned his face and ate no food. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said, how is it that your spirit is so sullen that you are not eating food? So he said to her, because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to me, give me your vineyard for money, or else if it pleases you, I will give you a vineyard in my place. But he said, I will not give you my vineyard. Now let me tell you, when I read those verses 5 and 6, and again, I've told you this before, use your imagination. But I can almost picture Ahab, and I have to read that in my mind as if it was a little child. Because doesn't that sound like a little child? We see a childish response. Again, according to God's law, God is the owner of the land. The people are just stewards. And that's a good reminder for us. We don't own anything in this life. God has allowed us to steward. I know sometimes we think that's my car, that's my house. Well, let me tell you, someday that car will end up in a junkyard somewhere. And if the Lord tarries, you're going to die and somebody else is going to live in that house. God allows us to steward. And it was meant to be passed down. And as I said a minute ago, the kings were commanded to respect this. So Ahab, just like a spoiled child, he goes home and pouts. He actually crawls into his bed, disappointed and refusing to eat. Now, if you've had a child in your home, does that not sound like? I won't ask you if you were ever guilty of that. Sometimes as adults, we pout. Now, we may not go home and crawl in bed, but let me tell you, we can pout.
I also see this as like, I know as a child, it certainly doesn't look that way as well, but if you've ever been through anxiety, anxious, depressed, stress, it'll drive you where you're not interested in anything else because
Yep.
something has consumed you.
Yes, exactly.
Not wrap around the situation. And so you find yourself, I just want to go to bed. I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
I think that's what we find here also.
Yeah. Ahab is consumed by this vineyard. Well, someone goes and tells Jezebel. Now, we know really who wears the pants in this relationship, right? It's Jezebel. Somebody goes and tells her the king is in bed and won't eat. So she goes, she finds him pouting, and she tries to find out what is going on now. I just get the sense that this isn't the first time Ahab's done this. And so Ahab tells her this sad story, right? He really wants this vineyard, and he went to Naboth, and he rejected his offer. What's interesting, that all Ahab could see was the rejection. He does not mention to Jezebel or bring it up the reason. Naboth gave him a reason. This is my family's inheritance. I can't sell it. God's given this to me. But Ahab neglects that. You know, when we get so focused on something, we forget details. We don't, when you're upset about something, you're upset with someone, you go and you tell half the story, right? That's why you need, when you're talking about something, you need to get both sides of the story. Ahab only tells part of the story to Jezebel. All he knows is that what he wants, he can't have. Now again, none of us good Christians this morning would ever admit to that. But we've got to be careful because that can creep into our lives. When we get so singularly focused on something that we have to have, that it appears that God's not ready to give it to us for whatever reason, that we allow that to creep into our hearts and distract us from all else. Because think about it. He's in bed. Who's supposed to be running the kingdom? The king was responsible for the nation. I'm sure he had his calendar was filled up every day, I'm sure. All of that is being neglected in this moment. So we see in the first 6 verses this wandering passion. Any other questions or comments before we go on to the next section? You're all intrigued by this story, right? Well, in verses 7 to 16, we see a wicked plot. Verse 7. Jezebel, his wife, said to him, "Do you now reign over Israel? Arise, eat bread, and let your heart be joyful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal, and sent letters to the elders and to the nobles who were living with Naboth in his city. Verse 9. Now she wrote in the letters, saying, "Proclaim a fast, and seat Naboth at the head of the people, and seat 2 worthless men before him, and let them testify against him, saying, 'You cursed God and the king. Take him out and stone him to death.'" A conspiracy of injustice. In verses 7 to 10, we see that Jezebel has a different view of land ownership. Now remember, Jezebel is a Gentile. In her kingdom and in the Gentile world, the king was sovereign, completely sovereign. Was more like what we would think of today as a dictator. And if the king wanted something, he simply took it. There weren't all of these laws that they had to abide by. So Jezebel has a different view. She has a different view of land ownership. She has a different view of the king's authority. She says, "Are you not the king? Can you not just take whatever that you want?" And then I love this. I read this as sarcastic. Sarcastically, she tells him, she orders Ahab, "Get out of bed and go get you something to eat." She promises him, "I'll take care of it." Again, I don't think this is the first time this situation has occurred. But she tells him, "I'll get Naboth's vineyard for you." Now, what's interesting here is that's all Ahab hears. "I'm going to get this vineyard." Did you see in the text there? Does he ask how? Does he want to know how she possibly is going to get him this vineyard? He doesn't want to know. "I don't want to know the details." Right? She told me I'm going to get my pretty toy, and I don't care how. That's all he hears. Jezebel is absolutely ruthless. She writes letters in Ahab's name to the leaders of Jezreel with this wicked plan of murder. What's interesting is she is going to actually use the worship of Jehovah God in her plot. Let me tell you, the Bible tells us, the New Testament tells us, Satan uses religion to get to us and to get his will. How many different religions are there in the world today in the name of God? How much, I think about across our country alone, how many so-called church services this morning will go on in the so-called name of religion and God. But she says, call for a fast. And that, again, would not be something that was unusual. Each city from time to time would call for a fast and have a special sacrifice in honor to the Lord. Remember, way back when we were talking about David and Samuel, when Samuel went to Bethlehem, what did he do? He went there to hold a fast in Bethlehem. So it was not something that was uncommon. But she says, I want you to set Naboth in the front. Set him up on the front row. And I'm sure he didn't have to fight anybody. You know, I never have to fight anybody for the front row on Sunday morning. It's amazing. So sit him on the front row. And then you bring in a couple of false witnesses. Again, she is using the law. You go back to the Mosaic law. In order to execute someone requires at least 2 witnesses. The law says no man will be put to death on the witness of one person. It requires 2. Remember the trial of Jesus? What were they trying to do? They were trying to get 2 people to agree on a story so they could convict Jesus. They couldn't even do that. Said, you call this fast. You get these 2 men to get up and tell their story that Naboth has blasphemed God and the king. And again, according to the law, that is punishable by death. It says you go and have these witnesses do this, and then before there's no appeal, there's no time lapse. We don't give you, he's not going to sit on death row for years. Said you take him out immediately and you stone him. Get him out of the way. In verse 11, so the men of his city, talking about Naboth, the elders and the nobles who lived in this city did as Jezebel had sent word to them, just as it was written in the letters which she had sent them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth at the head of the people. Then the 2 worthless men came in and sat before him. And the worthless men testified against him, even against Naboth, before the people, saying, Naboth cursed God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Verse 14. Then they sent word to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned and is dead. When Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money. For Naboth is not alive, but dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. Complicity in murder. We see the depths of wickedness in the nation of Israel. These leaders, these elders in Jezreel, they get this letter from Jezebel. There's no question. There's no protest. They all know that this is going to be a miscarriage of justice. They don't say anything. They don't send back and, are you sure about this, Jezebel? It's really wrong. We can't go away. Because did they not have the power to say no? Now, they may have feared Jezebel, and no doubt that they did. And they knew to buck her would cost them perhaps their own lives. But was that not the right thing to do? We have been blessed here in America. We've not really had to suffer persecution like many places around the world. And it's easy for us to stand here this morning and say, if somebody came in and said something and wanted me to recant my faith in God, I wouldn't do it even if they had a gun to my head. It's easy for us to say that because none of us think it's really going to happen. But there are places in the world every day where Christians have to stand up. But I will tell you what it may cost us today. It may cost you a job to stand up and do the right thing. It may cost you some relationships to stand up and do the right thing. We may have to stand up to someone who we greatly respect or fear. But it's the right thing. It's the right thing. These men have no courage to stand up against wrong. They do just as Jezebel had instructed. They bring Naboth in, they set him in the front where everybody in the village, everybody in the city can see him. These two men get up and tell their story. The elders do their part. Now keep in mind, it's not mentioned in Scripture here, but there is an order to this. So, as these men would tell their stories, it would rely upon the elders to pronounce judgment, to pronounce him guilty, and to sentence him to death. They are every much as guilty as Jezebel is. When sometimes we think, well, I'm just going with the flow, right? I'm not really doing anything. Let me tell you, if we're not standing up against evil, we're supporting it. Jesus said, either you're for me or you're against me. There's no middle ground. And so Naboth is falsely convicted. He is taken outside the city and he is stoned. And according to 2 Kings 9:26, it is not, even though the Scripture here just says Naboth's sons were also stoned. See, it wouldn't be enough just to kill Naboth because then his sons would inherit the property. They had to make sure that any living heir was killed. We don't know exactly how many sons Naboth had, and the word sons could apply to grandsons. No male of Naboth's family survived. Can you imagine that? And those elders standing there, watching and knowing what they have done. And so we see here that then these men, after it's all said and done, they send word back to Jezebel. Now don't miss that. Remember, she had written letters in Ahab's name. But these elders know who it came from. They don't send word back to Ahab. They send word back to Jezebel. And Jezebel quickly informs Ahab. Again, does Ahab ask any questions? He doesn't want to know the details. Sometimes, maybe in the back of his mind, he's just, something tragic has happened to Naboth, and now I can get I don't want to know the details. Do we ever live that way? I don't want to know the details. As long as I get what I want, I don't want to know the details. There are times, I'm going to say every time, but there are times where we need to investigate the details. And so she tells Ahab, get up, Naboth's dead, now go take his vineyard. And just like a child, Ahab gets up, he's happy now, I'm going to get what I want, and he goes to take possession of the vineyard. Verses 7 to 16, we see this wicked plot. Any questions before we go on to the last section? In verses 17 to 29, we see a woeful penalty. Verse 17. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone down to take possession of it. You shall speak to him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Have you murdered and also taken possession? And you shall speak to him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, In the place where the dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, the dogs will lick up your blood, even yours. Ahab said to Elijah, Have you found me, O my enemy? And he answered, I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Divine confrontation. God knows exactly what's went on. None of this is a surprise to him. He knows, and he sends Elijah. Now Elijah, we're not sure exactly where he was at. He could have been in Bethel or Jericho, some of the places where the prophets were. He may not have heard what's happened in the northern part of the nation, but God knows. God sends Elijah to Ahab with this message of condemnation, and God knows right where to find him. Now, as much as we think, or the world may think, that they can hide from God, let me tell you this morning, God knows right where you're at. God knows where every person this morning is at. He says, you go find him in Naboth's vineyard. God is aware of what's happened. And so, his question really to Ahab, he knows of the murder and the illegal possession. Ahab may not know the details, but God does. And so because of this, God issues a death sentence for Ahab. Ahab has been king for 20-some years. The most wicked king. And God has given him opportunity after opportunity to repent. And he has refused. And he says here to Ahab, the message to Ahab is the dogs will lick up his blood in the same place Naboth was killed. Now, we need to understand society back then was different than it is today. Dylan and I were talking about this the other day. See, dogs were not pets in Israel, in the ancient world. Dogs were dirty scavengers, right? Don't think about your pet at home that's clean and you pet it and it's all nice and sits on your lap or at your feet. Okay, dogs were about the lowest form. Remember what Jesus told the woman, the Gentile woman, when he was testing her faith? He said it's not good to take the children's blood and give it to dogs. Dogs were looked down on. They were dirty scavengers. And for someone to be told that the dogs were going to lick their blood was about the worst disgrace in death that you can imagine. Abuse of a body. Well, of course, Ahab lashes out at Elijah. Again, we see this childish response. He starts pouting again. Elijah, you've taken my joy. I just got here. I'm inspecting my new vineyard. My heart's merry. And you come and got this message of judgment. But Elijah reminds him from God, the real problem is his own wickedness. How often when we do not get our own way, we blame everybody but ourselves. It's somebody else's fault. Right? In America today, right, it's popular, right? If you didn't turn out very good, you blame your parents. Right? It's somebody else's fault.
Think about Charlie Kirk and what happened to him.
Yes.
Elijah was in the same situation. He knew
Yes, absolutely.
He's doing something that a lot of us, would not do, is to speak up in the midst of an audience that's going perverse, that's going backwards. We have the responsibility to carry God's word out, no matter where it's at, no matter what the consequences are. And again, Elijah, he knew that his life could be taken, but yet you see him still being faithful to God, following through, living out what he was commanded to do, sharing that information. So I think it's just important for us to understand that it might be difficult at times, even sharing stuff with our children. It's uncomfortable to tell them the truth. But what we see here is that sometimes it can lead to repentance.
Yes, absolutely. And so we have to stand up for truth, even though it costs us something. And that a good point there, Pastor Mike. We ought to be praying for all of these kids on these college campuses, because there is a movement there, and they're facing opposition. And so we need to be praying for them. It's a great point. In verse 21, God again is elaborating here on this great judgment. Behold, I will bring evil upon you, and will utterly sweep you away, and will cut off from Ahab every male, both bond and free in Israel. And I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, because of the provocation with which you have provoked me to anger, and because you have made Israel sin. Of Jezebel also the Lord spoken, saying, the dogs will eat Jezebel in the district of Jezreel. Verse 24, the one belonging to Ahab who dies in the city, the dogs will eat, and the one who dies in the field, the birds of heaven will eat. Surely there was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord, because Jezebel his wife incited him. He acted very abominable in following idols, according to all that the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the sons of Israel. Divine condemnation. We see the details here. God mentions no one has provoked him, his anger, or led Israel to sin like Ahab and Jezebel. We see that in verse 22, verse 25, verse 26. God is making it clear. This severe judgment is because of sin and disobedience. Ahab, his entire family. I find it interesting, God says all of his sons. What did we just say a minute ago? What happened to Naboth's sons? They would suffer. Ahab's sons, his family would experience such disaster and disgrace. All of his descendants. I mean, it's just like us today. If you think one of your loved ones has passed away, right? We want to give them a nice funeral and a burial, right? We want to take care, we want to honor them. But for Ahab's family, none of them would see a grave. Every male would be cut off, which is the same punishment that God had issued to Jeroboam and Baasha. Total destruction. Specifically, he calls out on Jezebel. The dogs would eat her body in the place the garbage is thrown. Now, we won't be covering it, but I encourage you to read the story of Jezebel's death. She is thrown down from an upper window, trampled by a chariot. And when Jehu sends men back to see her body, there is nothing left but the palms of her hands and her skull. The dogs. And her body ends up in the refuge dump. That's how severe. Ahab's family his sons who die in the city would be eaten by the dogs as well. And those who happen to die in the fields, the birds would eat them. They would not be buried. That is about the worst disgrace. But all of that let me remind you, all of that is a picture of what Satan wants to do to all of us. And it is a picture of what sin will do to us. I heard a saying the other day, I don't know if you've heard this, when we're young, we look like our parents. When we're old, we look like how we've lived. Have you ever met those people? They look like they're 100 and they tell you they're 30. When we live in rebellion and wickedness, it will wear on our bodies. Total condemnation. Lastly, verse 27. It came about when Ahab heard these words that he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and fasted, and he laid in sackcloth and went about despondently. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but I will bring the evil upon his house in his son's days. Delayed consequences. This severe message of judgment. I almost get the picture again. Elijah is looking him straight in the eye. With all of the seriousness and the boldness that Elijah can muster, he gives him this severe message. And for a moment, it clicks in Ahab. Momentarily, it sinks in. The magnitude. Because had not everything Elijah had said up to this point come true? Absolutely. Ahab immediately begins to mourn and humble himself before the true sovereign God of Israel. Now be careful here. It does not say he repents. There is nothing that changes in the kingdom. He doesn't deal with Jezebel. He doesn't get rid of the adultery. This is about him and the impact on him. It really is almost, you could consider it selfish mourning. It's human mourning. He's sorry, but not repentant. God, though, graciously recognizes his actions. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He does mourn before God, accepting the consequences. God sees that. He honors those actions, and he delays the consequences. He does not rescind them, but he delays them. And this judgment that he has issued will not be fulfilled until the next generation. See, Ahab will be killed in battle. And it is true that as they wash out his chariot in Samaria, that the dogs lick his blood. But it is his son Jehoram in 2 Kings 9 who is murdered by Jehu in Jezreel. And it says in the very spot there in that vineyard outside the city, the dogs will lick his son's blood. Delayed, but not rescinded. Let me tell you today, I believe as a church and in America, we can pray and God can move. But ultimately, this nation and all nations are headed to God's judgment. He may bless us graciously with delays, but judgment is coming. Any other questions and comments before I give you my closing thoughts?
I also think it's important that we do see this, take place later on, but there is still consequences for our actions as well. And so, even in the midst of what we're facing, we can be forgiven.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying that he was at all, but that we can be forgiven, but there's still consequences. Moses, certainly we find him later on, even with Christ, but it
Absolutely.
God is a God of just judgment as much as He is a love and mercy.
Yeah, absolutely. There are always consequences for sin. Well, let me leave you with a few things. Herbert Vanderloot says this: think of Christ and all that He has given you. That's the cure for greed. I think about that song, that old song, remember that? Count your blessings one by one. Sometimes we need to sit back and reflect on what God has done, the prayers He has answered. Number 2, God is in control of all, and one day He will make all the wrongs, or make right all the wrongs of this world. Let me tell you, there is coming a day of reckoning. And all wrongs. Maybe you've suffered wrongs, and maybe you've been mistreated. Naboth was certainly mistreated. One day, all things will be made right. And then lastly, many people turn to God in the midst of crisis, especially when impending judgment looms large, only to turn away when the crisis is over. Don't let that be the practice of your life. I've seen a lot of people come over the years, come to an altar and pray. Their marriage was on the rocks. They were dealing with some financial crisis. Boy, they needed God's help. But once that crisis passed, didn't see them in church anymore. Don't let that be you. God uses crisis sometimes to bring us to Him. But don't let that be the reason, or when it's over, the reason that you slip back into. Because that's worldly sorrow. We need godly repentance. Well, God bless you. Hopefully saw something new in that familiar story. As I said, next week we're going to jump into 2 Kings chapter 2, passing of the baton. The transition between Elijah and Elisha. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to jump clear towards the end of 2 Kings, chapters 18 to 20, a king who loved God. Wonderful story of Hezekiah and his love for the Lord. Well, God bless you and have a great rest of your Lord's Day.